Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you all turning out for, I can say this big word, the penultimate talk of the season, right? Because next month is the last one before you take your summer break. I just wanted to say, once again, thanks for coming. Thanks for being here and using our facilities and visiting us every month. It's always fun to see you and hear what's on tap with your speaker. That's all I got to say, and thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it, sir. Once again, we'd like to thank our hosts, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, for having us. It is always a great pleasure to be here. Our speaker tonight is a longtime friend of mine, someone who has been an inspiration for me as a researcher and an interpreter over the years, and someone who I've done a lot of work with over the years in a number of different capacities. A great researcher and ranger. Our speaker tonight is Brian Baracz of Antietam National Battlefield. And he is here representing the battlefield. So very gracious of him to do so. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Thank you to the Medical Museum for hosting. Thanks to the Roundtable for having me out. I can't say I grew up in Frederick, but I lived in Frederick more than I lived in my grow-up hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. So Frederick's home, and it's great. I love coming down and being in the old buildings and looking out down on the Patrick Street. So it's an honor to be here. I'm a little out of my element. As Matt said, I'm ranger at the park. I love giving my presentations and programs outside. I'm used to doing that more than I am used to working inside with the technology. And it's usually about once a year that I put together the PowerPoint program. And as I was working on that the past couple of days, I was working in the kitchen. I walked out into my living room. My wife was there, and she had earbuds in, and I was listening to music. And it turns out she had two computers going, and she was listening to the same music that I was listening to. I said, I'm listening to this. What's going on? Why two musics going? Why are you? She's like, there's too much yelling and swearing going on in the kitchen for me to do my work. So we're going to hope that this technology holds out and helps me through my program this evening. The program this evening is about George Sears Green and his division of soldiers at the Battle of Antietam. And it's not a topic that's often talked about at the battlefield. It doesn't neatly fit into the usual morning and midday and afternoon phases of battle. It's also, I think, important because we have visitors. Even this past week, someone came in and said, well, gave them the whole collect the fee, here's your brochure, here's the movie, so on and so forth. And said, well, where's the battlefield? I'm like, it's here. The visitors saying, this is the battlefield. Now, it's not the cornfields a half mile in one direction, the sunken roads a couple of yards out, the bridge is 2 miles away, but the location where the visitor center is was a focal point of the morning action of the battle. I'm going to assume that everybody in the room here, we've been to Antietam Battlefield. Anybody has not been to Antietam Battlefield? Okay, so we're familiar with some of the locations I'll be talking about. So we're going to focus on George Green, his division, where they sort of start their day, where they fight. They're engaged in 3 different places on the battlefield. And we'll also talk a little bit about some other things as well later on in the program. So I find it sometimes difficult to talk about the tactics and all this going on in areas in the battlefield if we're not out there. So we're going to try and kind of put you, by using some modern photos of the locations that we're going to talk about, try to put you out on the battlefield. At any point, if there's any questions, quick questions while I'm talking, don't mind that at all. Obviously, we'll try to save some longer questions till the end of the program. As I was looking for images for the title piece this evening, this is probably one of my favorite old drawings, images of Antietam. And the title of it is pretty generic. It doesn't specify, other than the church, what's going on. But what you can see in that photo, for the longest time, rangers that used to work at the park had told me for a while that this was the 125th Pennsylvania Regiment, and we've been in discussions about that before, but that was a large regiment, and I don't think it is that action, but anyway, I believe, looking at it more, that it might be depicting George Green and some of his activity at the high run around the visitor center. And as we look at the next photo, just to get the title off the screen there, you're going to hear about some Ohio regiments. They were small regiments, but they were fighting right next to each other. And so what we have here, two sets of regimental flags. Could be Ohio regiments fighting right near the church. They were on this part of the line, as you'll hear later on. We can see a Confederate battle flag off in the distance. And Confederates did attack from that area up towards George Green. And this caisson is interesting because if you're familiar with the famous image of the Dunker Church, that is the caisson in that Alexander Gardner photograph. So very interesting, the artist using, I think, his artistic license to depict a couple different points in time throughout the day of the battle. Before we dig into George Green and his actions, we have just a map of the Antietam battlefield, just a very general overview to try and put his actions into the big picture. Okay? So, let's see. New feature, laser pointer in the PowerPoint. I didn't know that was even college life. So our laser pointer here, Dunker Church. That area is where the visitor center is. I gotta use that. That's a little too much. Dunker Church, where the visitor center is located. Obviously north up here is your key. The cornfield, a half mile north of the visitor center. The East Woods, North Woods. First 4 hours of battle unfolded on this square mile of land. In the first 4 hours of battle, 10,000 casualties. Hardly the bloodiest square mile in the history of the nation. This piece of land right here. At about 9:30 in the morning, the battle shifted from this part of the field down towards the sunken road or Bloody Lane. Now, the Bloody Lane runs a long way, as most of you know, from Route 65 down to Route 34. But the fighting occurred in just this very small stretch from here to here. Between 9:30 and 1, 5,500 more casualties. Just this small part of the field. So by 1 in the afternoon, from the sunken road to the North Woods, you go stand behind the visitor center, the area you can see from there, close to 16,000 casualties by 1 o'clock again. I had already mentioned historians for the longest time have divided the battle into the phases, morning, midday, and afternoon. I like to look at it a little more. Route 34, the Boonesboro Shepherdstown Pike divided the battlefield. What's happening on this north end is really separate from what's happening down here. In the morning and midday are really one part of the battle. I like to look at it that way. But nonetheless, the Burnside Bridge, the fighting down here starts at about 9:30, the same time the fighting at the sunken road began. Roughly noon, federal soldiers carry the bridge. The final assault in this area of the field unfolds right about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's just as federal soldiers get up to the very end of the Confederate line, A.P. Hill's men arrive from Harper's Ferry. The battle slowly fades away as the sun sets in the battle. Even though the battle, 23,000 casualties, bloody single day in the history of the United States. A couple days later, ends Lee's first invasion of the North. A few days after that, Abraham Lincoln able to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. That's the very quick overview of the Battle of Antietam. How does George Green fit into that story? So first, a little bit about the Confederate forces that Green is fighting. You have to have one side if you're going to talk about the other side. So Confederate General D.H. Hill, he was the one entrusted with guarding the South Mountain Gaps. He had about 5,000 men under his command. As he's driven off of South Mountain, his troops fall back to the middle part of the Antietam battlefield, back towards the area around the sunken road. And in the days preceding Antietam, Hill's men stretched from this point up until this area, towards the Roulette Farm. If you're familiar with that. On the morning of the battle, Hill, 5,000 men, 5 groups or 5 brigades under his command. On the morning of the battle, Hill was instructed to send 3 of those 5 groups northward to help reinforce Stonewall Jackson in the northern part of the line. The remaining 2 groups are the ones that fight down at the sunken road. George Burgoyne Anderson and Robert Rhodes. I'm not going to talk about that, but Hill is really in charge of, in the late morning, or I should say mid-morning, in charge of what's going on the north end of the field, cornfield and so on, and then later on transferring down to the sunken river. George Sears Green is part of the Union 12th Corps. 12th Corps, well, we'll talk about Green first. Born in 1801, one of the oldest field commanders during the American Civil War. Second is class at West Point, graduates 1823. The Union 12th Corps. The organization of the armies at Antietam is really a kind of a microcosm of a lot of the questions we get asked at the battle. The size of the armies, how many soldiers in a regiment or a brigade, a division. And looking at the 12th Corps and comparing them to the 2nd Corps, it kind of really tells the story because it's hard for us to kind of give exact numbers in many cases. It's hard for us to say that a division is 15,000 men, or I should say a corps is 15,000 men, a division 5,000. Numbers really just change a lot, depending what organizations you're talking about. For example, the Union 2nd Corps, Edward Sumner, 15,000 men, the 12th Corps, half of that, 7,200 men. So in talking about some of these operations, sometimes it's hard to use kind of this nomenclature for an exact number of troops in a corps, division, brigade. So keep that in mind. When we talk about the 12th Corps, we kind of break that in half. And there are two groups or two divisions in the 12th Corps. Joseph Mansfield is a corps commander. It's his first time commanding soldiers on the battlefield during the American Civil War. He has Green troops under his command and veteran soldiers under his command. So that's important to keep in mind. I'm not going to go into it, but I just threw this next photo in here because many of you might be more familiar with George Green and his actions 9 months later at the Battle of Gettysburg. So that's George Green, memorialized on Culp's Hill. So, the Union 1st Corps, they're the first ones to move into the battle. Joseph Hooker, almost 9,000 men, fighting between sunrise, 5:45 in the morning, and right about 7 o'clock. His troops at that point used up, disorganized, casualties, so on and so forth. It's at that point the second large unit assault starts to unfold, the Union 12th Corps, Joseph Mansfield's men. And again, he has these Green troops and veteran soldiers. He believes he needs to set an example. First time on the battlefield, he wants to lead by example. He wants to see the veterans. He wants them to know that he's going to be out there helping them. He wants to guide these new troops in battle. But wanting to be out in front of the line, on top of a giant white horse, what's that make him? Perfect target. Very early on in the deployment of the 12th Corps, he's mortally wounded, shot through the chest. He survived until the following morning, but after he's wounded, the command structure of the 12th Corps starts to break apart. It's one of a couple times throughout the day, the Battle of Antietam, that about a half-a-mile gap will open up between large groups of Federal soldiers. And so what's going to happen is one part of the 12th Corps will move over from the East Woods kind of towards the Hagerstown Turn. Alpheus Williams and his soldiers. The other group, George Green's men, they advanced more through the East Woods in the famous cornfield. And so we're looking at this map here. I know it's very busy. This is one of the original maps from the Antietam Battlefield Board, a series of 14 maps drawn up late 1890s, early 1900s. Ezra Carman, who was the Antietam historian, if you will. So in addition to writing all the text for the War Department tablets that are along the tour road, he wrote a 1,200-page manuscript of the battle. Also drew up these maps to go along with the tablets and his manuscript. And so, yeah, I know they're quite busy. They're available through the Library of Congress. If you're looking for the maps, that's the best place to go, and you can zoom in and really take a great look at all the detail that these maps include, including different field patterns. So this line here is a plowed field. This here is a pasture field. This design, a cornfield. Trees for woodlots. Even down to the various fence lines. The zigzag or worm rail fences are depicted here. Post and rail fences are on the map. Rock walls, circles. They're going to be a little bit hard to see, but they're up along here. But at any rate, great detail, great detail. As you can see, a lot of detail on this map. The important thing, though, what we're looking at here, this is going to show us kind of the Confederate forces moving towards the cornfield and the Federal forces moving south towards the cornfield. This timestamp is right about 8 o'clock in the morning. And what we're looking at, back to the Confederates, General D.H. Hill, 5 groups, 5 brigades, 2 are kept at the Sunken Road, 3 are sent northward to help Stonewall Jackson. And so those groups, Roswell Ripley, his regiments right here, Alfred Colquitt, Samuel Garland. So those guys are pushing north. Our guys that we're talking about tonight, really focusing on George Green, his division up here moving south, heading towards the East Woods and the cornfield. George Green has 3 groups or 3 brigades under his command. One of them, William Goodrich, is up here, kind of off the map, because he's going to be sent over to this part of the field. So we're not going to really talk about him. Another story, another day. We're going to talk about Hector Tyndale and Henry Stanbrook. Hector Tyndale received an appointment to go to West Point. His mother did not want him to go. He does not go. His father passes away around that same time, so he becomes kind of the head of the family. Takes over the family business. Travels to Europe. He's an importer. He's one of the most popular importers in the city of Philadelphia. China, artwork. Tyndale's your guy. That's who you go to see. 4 regiments under his command, the 5th, the 7th, and the 66th Ohio, and the 28th Pennsylvania. Tyndale formed the 28th Pennsylvania. He outfitted them. He used his own money to outfit the regiment on uniforms and weapons. He'll rise to command the brigade, but nonetheless, he's connected to the 28th Pennsylvania. The 3 Ohio regiments combined number 425 men in 3 regiments. Meanwhile, the 28th Pennsylvania, well over 700. So this idea of how many men in a regiment, well, it depends which regiment you're talking about. So roughly 1,200 men in his brigade. Henry Stanbrook is the other brigade commander. He was a painter, specifically a grainer. So when you were constructing something, if you didn't want to pay for the high quality wood, you would use a cheaper material and then pay Mr. Stanbrook to come out and paint the wood grain. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Antietam and get up close to the Sheriff House, which is down in the south end of the battlefield, beautiful red brick house. Kind of the same idea. If you get up real close to the brick, you'll go up and see, especially higher up, you'll see white lines on the brick. What are those white lines? Again, to save money, folks back then, instead of buying the perfect brick and having a perfect mortar line, they'd go the cheap route. Inferior brick, or not inferior, but not the most perfectly cut brick. Maybe not the best mortar man around. You would build your structure, and then you would paint your entire house red, brick red, and then you would hire somebody to come in and stripe it, paint the mortar line. And you can see remnants of that on the Sheriff House if you visit the battlefield. Stain and stripe your house. Colonel Stanbrook survives Antietam. He dies months later at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But he's commanding the 3rd Maryland, 111th Pennsylvania, 102nd New York, about 1,300 men under his command. Back to our board map. You can see here the detail a little bit better. Again, cornfields, grass, for pasture fields, the green dot coming into view from the woods. So what we're looking at here, this is the famous cornfield. You can see the zigzag fences bordering the north and the south edge of the cornfield. You can see the fences, the post and rail fence along the Hagerstown Turnpike. this detail, these little circles, those are straw stacks. As Hill sends his men north, Roswell Ripley moves forward. It's pushed back. Colquitt, Alfred Colquitt's advancing. He's the last Confederate group to hold the cornfield. And just off our map, Samuel Garland, his brigade, they don't even make it up into the fight because they had a pretty tough day a few days earlier at the Battle of South Mountain. They're hit on the flank, and as they're pushing up northward at the Battle of Antietam, out in the distance they see a large force. Very quickly, rumors are spreading, they're getting on our flank. It's not looking good, and so they head for the rear pretty quick. They don't get involved very much in the Battle of Antietam. Alfred Colquitt, the last Confederate line to hold the cornfield. 5 regiments, 13th Alabama, 28th Georgia, 23rd Georgia, 27th Georgia, and finally the 6th, holding the northeast part of the cornfield. You go out to the battlefield today, you can hike the cornfield trail, you can go stand right in the spot. If you had the opportunity to go out on any of our battlefield hikes, walk the cornfield, this is one of my favorite places to stop. You have a great view of the field from here, and a lot of action unfolded here earlier prior to this. It's just a pretty important part of the cornfield. As George Greene's men were moving south, remember Tyndale was first, Henry Steinrug is coming in on the flank, and that's going to cause a problem. Also important on the maps, you can see these circles, providing elevation, providing the details of elevation. As Greene's men are moving to the battlefield, they're moving off of the George Line Farm. They arrived at the Line Farm in the early morning hours of September 17th. They were ordered at about 11 on the evening of the 16th, 11 at night, to cross the creek to go and assist Joseph Hooker. Be in position to assist on the following morning. There's so many great quotes we have come across as researchers and rangers. The soldiers' depictions are just fantastic. Soldier in the 12th Corps described the evening of the 16th. Now it's raining and misting, low clouds, pitch black. But he described, as we today would say pitch black, he described it as inky black. Inky black. It's an awesome description. The members of the 12th Corps Line Farm, one remembered that they were halted in the middle of a freshly manured field. It's raining. They're in the middle of a manure field. It's pitch black, and for many of them, it's going to be their last night on the earth. But as they're making their way towards the field, they're moving off the George Line Farm. They're passing through a narrow cornfield over this farmland right here, Hoffenberger farmland. Then they move through this part of the East Woods, and then again back to these lines. This little bump right here doesn't look like much on the map, but it was very important to these soldiers because the troops from Ohio, specifically the 66th Ohio, Eugene Powell, remembered that they moved over through this cornfield, over the fence, into the woods. They moved up to this rise of ground, and then all of a sudden they're on the battlefield. He remembered that mist and fog rendered everything obscure and absurd, but peering through the cloud of vapor, I noticed a line of the enemy standing just beyond and behind a rail fence. He gave the order to fire. He saw these guys right here, 6th Georgia. No sooner did he give that command that the soldier commanding the regiment next to him, 7th Ohio, Orrin Crane. Now remember, the regiments are very small. The commanders are very close together. Orrin Crane says, no, wait, don't fire into those men. Those are our own soldiers. So at the high point of battle, these guys are 20 yards away. These two guys from the Buckeye State butt heads. Should we fire or should we not? Should we fire or should we not? Very quickly though, Eugene Powell, he wins out that argument and he gave the order to fire. Fires almost point blank into the faces of the 6th Georgia. By that point, 20th Pennsylvania, this large regiment, again, you can see the detail on these maps. 3 small lines representing those Ohio regiments. 1 long line representing that large regiment, the 20th Pennsylvania. So it's taking longer for them to kind of swing around, but eventually they'll get right on the flank of the 6th Georgia. Commander of this brigade, Alfred Colquitt, said, "We were exposed to a fire from all sides and nearly surrounded. The enemy closed in upon our right, so near that the ranks were scarcely distinguishable. Heavy hand-to-hand fighting broke out in this northeast part of the cornfield. Men using their bayonet, if they didn't have a bayonet, they're using their musket, turning it around, using it as a bat to strike down their opponent. 6th Georgia took no more than 250 men into battle. 198 killed or wounded. One of the highest casualty rates. Some folks go to Antietam and for a long time, we'll never know the answer, but for the longest point, First Texas, highest casualty rate, Battle of Antietam. Throughout the Civil War, 6th Georgia is right up there with it. There was even afterwards when Ezra Carman was putting together his material for the Antietam Battlefield Board, the 1st Texas guys and the 6th Georgia guys are arguing back and forth. 1st Texas supposedly took 230 couple into the battle. Well, that then bumped their number down a little bit as far as percentage killed. And so the remaining members contacted the Battlefield Board and said, well, we didn't go into the battle with 230 couple men. We only went in with 211 because we sent 2 guys from each company with canteens down to Sharpsburg, and they didn't go into the battle. So that lowered their number down. So then the percentage raised up. But at any rate, this line cannot hold. The 6th Georgia, their flank is exposed, they are forced to fall back. The next regiment down, the 27th Georgia, their flank's exposed, they fall back. Then the 23rd Georgia, the 28th Georgia, finally 13th Alabama. Jacob Orth from the 5th Ohio will capture the battle flag of the 13th Alabama. 2 soldiers in Green's division were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for capturing flags down on Antietam. But Colquitt's men will fall out of the cornfield. They'll fall back across the Smoketown Road and back behind the Dunker Church. At that point in the battle, from the cornfield south to the Sunken Road, there were no Confederate forces. Green's men will follow up. They'll follow the Confederates. And still, while that's going on, as they're following and chasing the Confederates, the famous position of artillery, where the ridge that the visitor center stands on today, S.D. Lee and his guns, they're firing their last rounds towards Green's men as they're advancing out of the cornfield and over the fences bordering the Smoketown Road. Eugene Powell from the 66th Ohio said the line at the fence where the enemy was standing when we gave our first fire was awful beyond definition. Dead men were literally piled upon and across each other. As Green's men are advancing, they come to the realization that they're running low on ammunition. And so after crossing the fences bordering the Smoketown Road, they will then hunker down into, again, looking at these topography lines here, there's a swale down behind the visitor center. If you go stand on the high ground where the visitor center is located, and you look out towards South Mountain, the land drops off. It's in that swale where Green halts his soldiers. They've gone through the ammunition, they need to be resupplied. And it's at that point, right about 8:30 in the morning, there is a lull in the battle. By that point, there were close to 10,000 casualties on that square mile land we pointed to earlier. So this map is depicting Green kind of awaiting his supplies. And so we've kind of moved south on the battlefield board maps. Again, very busy, very busy. The move-out farm up here in the top right, just to kind of get you in your head thinking of where we are located. So the Dunker Church, see a little square with the Across on top, visitor center stands right about here. If you've ever noticed as you're walking up to the visitor center, the lines of rock and limestone in the grass there as you're walking up, those are depicted by these lines right here. So the visitor center sits right about here, right about here. And this map is labeled right about 9:30. And so what it's showing is Green's position stretching from the Moomaw Lane back up towards the Smoketown Road here. There's a little bit of reorganization on both sides at about 8:30. And then at about 9:15 in the morning, the Union 2nd Corps, Sedgwick's division, will move just off this map towards the West Woods. This is the West Woods right here. Green's men are down in this swale while that's going on. Green is able to see a large body of forces to the north moving into the woods. Just keep that in mind because that comes into play a little bit later on in our story. Right about 9:30 in the morning, the same time, soldiers are starting to attack towards the sunken road. This line here is the end of the U.S. line going towards the sunken road. They're anchored right on the Moomaw Lane, which is just off this map on a dead end to the sunken road. So you can see there's kind of this connection here. The blue up here, those are the troops that were pulling into the West Woods behind the Dunker Church. So Green is kind of filling this hole, and going back to this idea of half-mile gaps opening up in the Union battle line. It's depicted right here. This regiment here, all the way extending towards the observation tower, just off the map here, that's part of the 2nd Corps. There's another group of 2nd Corps troops up here, and then in the middle is George Green's division. So this is showing Union 12th Corps split by half a mile, and it's also showing parts of the Union 2nd Corps being split by distance here. The 2nd Corps line extends almost all the way out to the observation tower down here on the Bloody Lane, and the line that went to the West Woods is way far on the other side of modern Route 65. We all know the story of the Confederates attacking the U.S. troops in the West Woods. Not a planned attack, not a surprise attack, just a really immediate engagement. Large bodies of forces moving from different sides of a huge wood plot. They cannot see each other moving towards that same area. Eventually, as the Federal soldiers pull into the West Woods, they're hit on the flank. And that's what's going on right here. But what we're going to be focused on, Kershaw's soldiers from South Carolina. 2nd, 3rd, 7th, and 8th South Carolina, they will hit the end of the Union line just behind the Dunker Church. Kershaw is able to stop his troops from getting swept up in this follow of the Federal soldiers out of the West Woods. Kershaw is able to hold back the 2nd, 7th, and 8th. He loses the 3rd. But the 2nd, 7th, and 8th, Kershaw is able to pull them back. He's reorganizing. And then Green's men will start moving to the top of this ridge here. Just as they get to the top of the ridge, they see this activity. And they see Kershaw getting ready to reform and assault. And so Green's men are quickly pulled. They said, pulled back behind the ridge. Pulled back behind the ridge. Warren Crane said, after receiving a supply, we marched to an elevation where we had waited the advance of the enemy. We then received orders to fall back under cover of the hill and awaited the advance of the Confederates. When within a short range, our troops were quickly thrown to the top of the ridge. We then poured volley after volley into their advancing column. So terrific was the fire of our men that the enemy fell like grass before the mower. You can see these red arrows going right at these pieces of artillery. Part of John Tompkins' Rhode Island artillery battery of 6 guns, 6 rifle guns, heavily engaged, so much so that they fire over 1,000 rounds of ammunition in 3 hours between those 6 cannons. High rate of fire. They fire the gun so quickly that the back of the can actually kind of melts away. They had to replace their guns, replace the events after the battle. But what's going on right here, this end, right flank of the battery is hit by those South Carolinians. Soldier in the battery remembered when the charge was at the height, one of the rebels, a man over 6 feet tall, came up to our number 4 gun with his bayonet fixed. Our number 1 man was in the act of sponging his piece. When he saw this tough, tall rebel approaching, he swung himself under the muzzle as he had no other way of protecting himself. But one of our infantrymen, who was in the act of loading his weapon, swung his gun around, clubbed his musket, and struck the Confederate just over the left ear, which put an end to the poor fellow. Very quickly, Greene's men will drive back that Confederate attack. So this view here, Greene's men on the ridge looking towards this area. That's where Kershaw's men, as you can see this line here, that would have been filled with trees at the time of the battle. So Kershaw's men moved from those trees across the Hagerstown Turnpike up this ridge. And in this photo, Tompkins' guns would have been just to the left, just off the left edge of the image there. That's the view from the Confederate point. So again, just off this edge is where the artillery was posted. Up in front, right, pretty much in this area, 28th Pennsylvania, and then the Ohio regiments further off to the left or to the north. Just as Kershaw's men are falling back into the woods, another Confederate attack will originate just a little further north. 46th and the 48th North Carolina and the 30th Virginia. 48th North Carolina, let's see if this one's going to show that. So again, this is showing a couple different times here. Greene's men are down behind the ridge. We'll advance up to this high ground, and then this is showing the attack of the 48th, the 30th, and 46th. 48th North Carolina, as they advanced out of the woods, they wrapped around the Dunker Church. So when you go to the battlefield today, you could sit on that high ground and just imagine this unfolding. The painting I showed earlier in the program, that was the title slide, if you will. That action is what I think is being depicted. This right here is what's depicted in that image. In the 30th Virginia, Captain William Saunders was talking to Benjamin Rawlins, and Benjamin Rawlins said to Captain Saunders, "My, don't we look conspicuous in our red battle shirts we're going to wear into the fight today?" 30th Virginia, in 15 minutes of action, they took 236 men into battle, 49 were killed, 105 wounded, 10 prisoners, 10 missing, 172 lost out of 236, 64% casualty. 30th Virginia. After the battle, William Saunders was found by his men right next to the Dunker Church, leaning against a tree. He had been killed. He was holding a daguerreotype with a loved one out. After driving that second attack back, Greene's men will then follow up. There's a hole in the fence that they had made previously for these guns to move down the Smoketown Road out into the field. And so they'll use that hole in the fence, follow down the road, and take up position right here behind the Dunker Church. So today, if you're at the battlefield on a busy day, this area right here would be some overflow parking. Right here, there used to stand a house right across from the visitor center up until about 2 weeks ago. That house was removed with the help of the Battlefield Trust, National Park Service, a historic Antietam Foundation. Acquired the land, the Park Service bought it, the house came down. So that area is now open. You can walk through here and get a better understanding of the action that took place here. For the longest time, you couldn't do that. And I've been looking at this when I started putting this program together. I was going through my files, I found a file labeled George Green PowerPoint. The date was 2002. I had been at the battlefield for 1 year, so I opened up the PowerPoint and I'm like, oh, needs a little bit of work. We're gonna start over again. So, but anyway, at that point, just up until 3 weeks ago, you couldn't walk on this piece of land. And I always had a hard time trying to understand these regiments here being able to fire into Greensmen, which is gonna happen in just a second. But at any rate, now that we can walk out here, you have a much greater understanding of what and why things unfolded the way they did. Greensmen will hold that position behind the church for about an hour. While they're there, there's going to be a little bit of a change because, again, these Ohio regiments, being so small, they had suffered casualties up in the cornfield. They had suffered casualties on the ridge where the visitor center stands. When they go into the woods, there's not many left. And so Green will receive some reinforcements. And again, looking at the detail of these maps, how detailed are they? Moving forward one map, switch out has been made. The Ohio regiments are pulled out of this area back to here, and they are replaced with the 13th New Jersey and the Purnell Legion from Maryland. You go today behind the Dunker Church, a little gravel lane leads you right down here, kind of right on the end of this line. There's a marker out there. I have a photo of it. We'll show you later on. But you can go stand behind the church, and you're standing right behind George Green's kind of L shape here in the woods. So again, they hold that area for about an hour. While that is going on, all the action down here, the sunken road, the bloody lane, is unfolding. And it is right about noon. At the same time the sunken road falls, Confederate counterattack. While they're holding this whole time for an hour, George Green and the commander of the 13th New Jersey, Ezra Carmen, they're back and forth. Green believes his flank is protected. Remember when he was down here in the swale, he saw 5,000 federal soldiers move in above him, and he thought that his troops, those 5,000 men, were still there, but they were not. They had been driven out of the West Woods. So Green believes the flank is secure. Carmen's telling him, no, it's not. You see the Confederates right down in front of him. Green is saying, no, you're fine. I saw those guys go into the woods. Green had no idea they had been driven out. In addition to receiving some infantry support, against the better judgment of Battery Commander Joseph Knapp, his soldiers from Pennsylvania, his artillerists from Pennsylvania, 2 guns, so a Union battery, a Federal battery, 6 cannon, Confederate battery 4. They couldn't agree on much. They couldn't agree on the size of the batteries either. Knapp is instructed to send one section, one group of 2 guns, and you can see them depicted right here. 1 cannon sitting right in the middle of the Hagerstown Turnpike. As you leave the visitor center today, you can kind of make the left turn to head south or turn right to go to the church. There was a cannon sitting right in the middle of the road at about 12 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the battle. Another gun was pushed up into the woods. Lieutenant Gill, in charge of that section, he did not think it was a good idea to put cannon in the woods. Very quickly, he was proved to be true. As the gun rolls up in behind the infantry regiments, these Confederates from the 27th North Carolina and the 3rd Arkansas are firing towards them. Almost simultaneously, on the other end, up by Ezra Carmen, those lines get so close, they realize that they're not friendlies, so they start firing at one another. The cannon gets to the woods, branches, huge trunk falls on the cannon, disables it. Long story short, Green's men at about noon are driven back out of the area behind the Dunker Church, up the Smoketown Road towards the eastwards. Just to kind of finish that story, you can see the lines for these Confederate regiments. They advanced over the ground that the South Carolinians advanced over, pretty much right over the visitor center is today. They moved down the hill, cross the Moomah Lane, think a pretty good way past the tour road. The modern tour road today running towards the Bloody Lane, there's a tour stop right about here. Confederates advanced past that. These regiments here that fought at the sunken road, they were called back and they're positioned along the roulette lane and they're firing up towards these Confederates. So you can see very quickly a line goes like this and then circles back around. Those regiments are driven back out. At that point, the fighting in what is certainly the battlefield, contrary to what people come into the field and ask, where's the battlefield? You're standing in the center of it. At that point, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the high ground where the visitor center stands becomes no man's land. Neither side can hold it, but both sides control it. So the fighting in that center part of the field quiets down. You can probably understand now, it's hard to put that action into the idea of morning, midday, and afternoon phase of that. It's kind of hard to get into that level of detail with a visitor who's coming to the front desk saying, where's the battlefield? So being able to talk about this, certainly important, and certainly talks to the idea that there was heavy fighting around that area where the visitor center stands. Also leads to the idea that this idea of morning, midday, and afternoon, three distinct parts of the battle, they really all kind of blend together in many cases. Antietam is very different from Gettysburg. Everybody in the room has been up to Gettysburg. And you've seen over 1,300 monuments at Gettysburg. And how many do you see when you come to Antietam? Not that many. Not that many. And that is for a whole other story, kind of the creations of the battlefield and the differences and a little bit of similarities. But at any rate, there are quite a few monuments on the Antietam battlefield for these U.S. soldiers we just spoke about. The three Ohio regiments, 5th, 7th, and 66, you might recognize this. It sits right out front of the Dunker Church. You might have driven through that or past that numerous times and saw the regiments. You're like, how does this fit in the story? Why is it in such a pretty important, significant place on the battlefield, right across from the famous Dunker Church? So Ohio dedicates their monuments in 1903, in October of 1903. Just beyond it, a little bit different, the Maryland monument. Maryland, as a few other states you're going to see, they will construct one large state monument and then place smaller markers around the battlefield where individual units fought. And so the state monument there dedicated on Memorial Day in 1900. And then markers like these will denote where individual regiments fought. And so this is marked for the Purnell Legion right behind the Dunker Church, 34th New York monument. Just to the left of this is the monument to the 125th Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, that's right behind the church. And so that's monuments the way that Maryland placed them on the field. You have the state monument and then smaller markers around the field. New Jersey, the same thing. Their monuments are dedicated on the anniversary of the battle in 1903. Same year, Ohio placed their monuments. They do not both states place on the anniversary because New Jersey, they were fortunate enough to have the president, Teddy Roosevelt, come out and speak at the dedications, and Ohio decided that's going to be wise not to dedicate our monuments on the same day as the president's going to be here. So they pushed their dedications back until later in the fall, October of 1903. But nonetheless, New Jersey, very similar to Maryland and Indiana. State monuments. So this is the New Jersey State Monument, and then they will place small markers. Again, this is the one marking the position, furthest most position of the 13th New Jersey behind the Dunker Church. The other regiments in 28th Pennsylvania, and the regiments in Stainhurst Brigade, 102nd New York, 111th Pennsylvania, they all have monuments up at Gettysburg. Typically what happens is most of the regiments want to say that they were involved in Battle of Gettysburg, and they'll all place their monuments at Gettysburg. And the monuments placed at Antietam, especially the Pennsylvania ones, are kind of more of an afterthought. And they're not placed until much later than the ones at Gettysburg. Georgia State Monument. First Civil War monument placed by the state of Georgia outside of the state. That was dedicated on the 100th anniversary of the battle in 1962. That monument sits right along Cornfield Avenue, between tour stop 3 and 4. So this evening, we'll wrap up here in just a couple minutes. We were really having to visualize these places on the battlefield, using these maps or the couple images I had, trying to kind of understand what happened there. But I always like to talk about kind of the real reason, what's really important. And it goes back to the individual soldiers. Right. Alexander Gardner and assistant to Matthew Brady arrived just a couple days after the battle. And we start to see these images of the individual soldiers, putting faces to places or to stories that we've heard. This is Joseph Knapp's battery. They happen to be right in the area where Gardner was taking images of the famous Dunker Church. It's 2 days after the battle. This image is, if you can picture the New York State Monument, the tallest monument right up on the hill behind the visitor center. This monument is looking out north towards the cornfield. Back here, you can go on to the Library of Congress, you can really blow this up, you can see the fence line along the Smoketown Road heading out to this group of trees, the East Woods. Knapp is sitting on a horse right here. Another image from that same area. If we can go back in time, Alexander Gardner would be standing right here, pointing his camera right in this direction towards these rocks. And this is right behind the visitor center. Captured this famous image. Civil War photography expert William Fresnito, in his unbelievable study of Civil War photographs of Gettysburg and Antietam, determined that the location of this photo was right behind the visitor center. He was using these rocks right here, which can be seen in the previous image. Right in here. This one, going back to the idea of the individual soldier, looking more closely at this image, we have a headboard right here. It's hard to see in this photo until you start blowing it up. You can see the mound of dirt in front of the headboard. Now, on the headboard, you can make out the name John Marshall, 28 Pennsylvania. This speaks to two things. Number one, the battlefield burials, right near a rock outcrop. How long do you think before the first rain would wash this dirt away? How deep do you think this is? Great. Not that deep. So for the longest time, we were pretty certain that Fresnito had found the spot where John Marshall's grave was located. Marshall also was then reinterred in the Antietam National Cemetery, and you can go visit his grave today in the Pennsylvania section. But about 5 years ago, we were informed of the unbelievable find. The New York City Public Library was digitizing their map and photograph collection. And next month's speaker, Gary Edelman, he gave me a call. We were sitting at home. This was during the pandemic. We were sitting at home. He called me and said, I just sent you an email. Get on the phone. Call me back. Once you get all set up, I want to hear your reaction when you open up this email. I'm sure you all know Gary Edelman. It's a little exciting. Some would say flies off the handle pretty quickly in some instances. Okay, Gary, give me a couple minutes. I'll do it. And I opened it up, and the image that was in the email was of a burial map of the Antietam National Battle. It was created in 1864. S.G. Elliott. He's a railroad tycoon, engineer, photographer. Nonetheless, travels west. Long story short, created two burial maps of Gettysburg and Antietam. Gettysburg map, we had known about that since, I think it was 1938. The Antietam map, we've known about for 5 years. Some similarities and some differences. One of the biggest differences, on the Antietam map, even though there are fewer graves, there are more graves individually labeled. And so on the Antietam burial map, one of the labels is that of John Marshall. And in this case, X marks the spot where he was buried. And it ties in with Fresnito's research. Also, we're looking at here very quickly, if you hadn't seen it before. Again, obviously the Dunker Church. Every plus is a US soldier buried. Line is a Confederate soldier. This comma device, or where horses have been gathered to be burned. There are almost 5,000 graves on the Elliott Barrow map. We have a copy of that on our park website, but also the New York City Public Library, you can find it there. But in wrapping up, we've gotten to the weeds of the story of George Green. And if I need to clarify something, I certainly can. I've been looking at that for 20 years. But in the end, it goes back to these stories of Knapp, of William Saunders, Eugene Powell. It goes back to John Marshall. It's those individual stories of the sacrifice and suffering that took place in Antietam. Those are the stories to take home. Their sacrifice and suffering, those are the stories that you should never forget. I want to thank you all for joining me this evening. Thank you for coming out. Beautiful evening, listening to my program. Turn it over to you guys. Want me to answer questions? How do you guys work that? Want me to answer questions? Thank you very much.
Can you discuss the lack of communications between the 12th and the 2nd Corps at that time?
Yeah, I think it's really just the confusion of everything that's going on. I mean, you're looking at, especially in the 12th Corps, Mansfield doesn't even have a staff. He is so new, the commander of the 12th Corps, Joseph Mansfield. I mean, when he's put in command of the Corps, he doesn't arrive to those guys until the 15th of September. Before he leaves Washington, he sends a note to his son, pack your pockets with sandwiches and come follow me. It's just a great adventure. He has nobody. He has his cook, and that's about it. When he gets to the Antietam battlefield, McClellan will give him a few guys. And then once he's wounded, I mean, there's very little communication. Sumner is with his guys, and so that leads to some issues too, because he's on the far end of the line, up around when the division goes into the West Woods. Sumner's up on that far north end, kind of along the south edge of the cornfield, to put a landmark on it, along Stark Avenue today. That's where Sumner is, and most of his corps is down at the Sunken Road. So there's really nobody to communicate. And then these casualties start mounting up, and I don't have the numbers. We have an excellent volunteer. Matt works with them. Joe Stahl, he's done some great research on looking at the loss of leadership in the upper echelons of command. And the problem is communication isn't, it's not pulling out your cell phone and typing away and hitting send, right? It's not pulling out a sheet of paper and a pencil and handwriting a note and giving that to a runner or somebody on horseback, hoping they get there. And then once they get there, hoping those orders are followed upon. Sometimes that worked, other times that didn't work. So, yeah, I don't think I can't speak much to it other than it's a mess. It's a mess. And then lack of visibility, the rolling terrain. I mean, Green thinks there's 5,000 soldiers on his flank when he pulls into the trees behind the West Woods, and they're not even there. I mean, how could something like the tragedy that happens in the West Woods, 2,200 casualties in 15 minutes, how does that go unnoticed by a guy that's not even a quarter mile away? So, I don't know if that does a good job answering that question.
No, actually, it did, but there wasn't any.
There wasn't any.
That's a photo of Knapp's battery. It's one of my favorites. And didn't they, the one guy mentioned, talk about having that photograph taken?
I believe there's an account of that. Yeah, they remember having that photo taken. Yeah. I think what's interesting would be, I think if I remember correctly, so a majority of Garner's photos were taken in stereo, so they were two parts to the image. There were some that was just one glass plate, but a lot of these images ended up being these stereo cards. And knowing that they lost a cannon, it would be interesting to see and go back and look at if one half has a little more left or right to see if they have, how many guns they have in that lineup. I'm betting they probably have 5. Unless they have to leave the cannon, but because the Confederates retreat, they're able to more likely go back and get the gun. So what kind of condition is it in? Were they able to make the repairs to get it back into the line for this photo? We might never know that.
You may not be able to comment on this, but read an edict from the Secretary of the Interior yesterday.
Mhm.
Bug bars, or something close to that. And I think this affects all parks. But it says, even though we watch your personnel, we don't want you to shorten your park hours or shut anything down.
Yep.
So go out and borrow rangers from other parks or find more volunteers.
Yeah, that's yeah, we can't close anything, and we are losing staff.
What was the question?
Current situation, the parks, not closing parks and so on, or rotate people from other parks. Well, those parks are in this same situation,
Yeah.
same situation as we are. I mean, we have a facility staff, maintenance staff of 4 guys. What's your lawn look like right now? It's growing pretty quick, right? We have 11-acre national cemetery, so how long does it take to mow an acre? And then put 5,000 headstones that you have to weed whack around. How long is that gonna take? And then, knowing that there's only 5 work days in a week, and if one of those days rains, well, you're kind of stuck on those 2 days. That's just the national cemetery. We have to mow around the visitor center. We have 10 tour stops we have to take care of, and 15 miles of trails. That's just mowing. So, yeah, it's gonna be an interesting summer. I can say that, interesting summer. On that note, yeah.
How many men would be on a cannon crew, and how many men would it take to move a cannon?
You would hope to load and fire the cannon, you would have 4 guys right around it. You'd have another guy, kind of the gunner, looking downrange, so we're up to 5, and then you have a couple guys running the ammunition back and forth, and then a couple guys back on the rim. So you're hoping to have, to fire the cannon, 6, 7 guys, for just one of those guns. And then you're hoping to have 2, more likely 4 horses to pull each gun. Some of these images there's some great images of a Civil War artillerists in their battery grouping. It covers huge, 100 yards? Is that the number? Like a football field is what kind of put these guns, and you're supposed to have, when they put these on the line, they're supposed to have about 20 yards between each gun from wheel up to wheel up. So I mean, stretch 6 guns, stretch it out a long way. It's over a football field. So then you put all this other stuff behind it. Yeah, it's a lot to move. Logistics, just for an idea, on marching 1,000 Civil War soldiers takes up about a mile of road space. So we say the unit army, everything from infantrymen, artillerists, to wagon train. George McClellan's 80,000 men included that. That line stretches from here to Washington, D.C. If you line them up in a straight line. It's a lot of stuff.
If you needed to withdraw the batteries or retreat the batteries, is that usually happening at the same time as infantry, or are they trying to retreat the cannons first? So the infantry can or is it just kind of?
It all really depends on the situation, because if you get close enough, and if you have an opponent coming up close on your guns, they're not shooting so much more at the guys working the guns, they're shooting at the horses because they can't get the guys off the field. So another hand, summer.
I remember the day when the burial mat came out. Was there a feeling that this existed somewhere, had existed? Did we know if there had been such a map ever made?
I can remember when we were getting ready to redo our visitor center, we took a field trip up to Gettysburg, and my buddy Keith and I, we stood in front of the burial map of Gettysburg. That was huge on the wall, from floor to ceiling, 15 feet high. It's like, oh my gosh, wouldn't this be incredible to have something like this for Antietam? We had no idea that it existed. And now that it's out there, again, in some cases, X marks the spot. Other cases, there's a lot more questions. And I mean, we didn't know how many graves were on there. So again, we had a lot of time during the pandemic to do research and work on our exhibits and stuff like that. We were very fortunate in that regard. But one day I sat there because we knew we were going to start getting questions about how many graves are on the map. So I went and took and sectioned off the map, and then because it was scanned in such high resolution, I could blow that up, and I was counting each grave on that map 4,866, I think was the number that we came up with. We broke it out. Again, it's different from the Gettysburg map in that the burial map for Antietam was created while the soldiers were still on the battlefield. The Gettysburg map created after the soldiers had been removed to the National Cemetery. So I think that also speaks to why were there 50 names on the Antietam map and only 4 named on the Gettysburg map. But there are sections missing from the Elliott burial map of Antietam. The whole right section is torn off. And in one of the jagged edges, you can see there are graves on the edge. If you look at the Gettysburg map, on the edges, Elliott included pertinent information on this farm. 350 Confederates, 270 federal soldiers. So what information is missing from that map? So there's one map out there. We hope that there's another map somewhere that we find at some point that kind of fills that information in. I don't know, we'll see.
Where was that? Antietam about that? I'm sorry.
The New York City Public Library, they're digitizing their stuff. And they just,
Okay.
they're just, knowing how things work, the person that, you can't lay blame to somebody for not saying, hey, we're putting this online. I mean, New York City Public Library, their collection is incredible. Priceless artifacts. So, I mean, they're just scanning stuff and it's going on their website. One person scanning it, probably 3 other people pass this through before it ends up on the website somewhere. So, one day somebody did a search, Elliott map, and a new return came back. Antietam burial map. New York City Public Library. So that's up in, it wasn't, Gary got found it, his good friend Tim Smith was doing research on the map maker, S.G. Elliott. He and Andrew Dalton, Tim and Andrew were doing research on Elliott because they were doing research on that Gettysburg map. And every month they would check to see if new stuff turned up online, and all of a sudden new stuff turned up and it was Antietam map. So.
Brian, do you have a rough idea how many folks that were buried on the Elliott map were later removed from there and buried somewhere else, or just impossible to tell?
And you can say a pretty good number.
Okay.
90%, 95% were taken up from the field, taken other places. 1988, we found 4 by the Stone Tower, by the observation tower. 2008, a Union soldier from New York was found north of the cornfield. Those are not the only 5 that were missed. So, I mean, we don't know. But I would say a good number. Looking at the numbers in the National Cemetery, what was on the map, most of them were found.
Oh, good.
Most were found. Joe, you had a question?
I have a question.
Yeah, go
Not so
ahead.
much about that
Sure.
action itself. But you were mentioning about the visitor center being right in the midst of the battle.
Mhm.
And I know that you recently redid it. What was the discussion about relocating the visitor center?
Money.
Yeah.
Building a whole new, we only had $12 million.
Okay.
Build a whole new visitor center.
Yeah.
Plus then the idea is, where do you put a new visitor center? That land is already disturbed. It's not going back the way it was. Where else do you want to tear up? Plus then you start looking at, well, put it down in the town of Sharpsburg. It's a one stop sign. It's not town. You can't get all the traffic that comes to the visitor center into the town of Sharpsburg. So there's a lot of, and then, then becomes a problem when you tore up this part of it down. Or if you want to put on land that we don't have yet, you can't do that. So there were discussions, but the big thing boils down to money. Yeah. We only have 12 million to work with. That wasn't enough. Okay, because the building.
You did well with that.
We're still working on the leak.
My question was on the visitor center too.
Yeah.
I know you had contractor problems.
Mhm.
Is that pretty well straightened out now? Because that was,
Well, that building still leaks hard. So all the work was done by a contractor. No Park Service, let me say that. Park Service was not involved in any of that renovation. It was fenced off. If you went by there, it was fenced off. We gave them the keys to the building for as long as they needed. Well, it was supposed to be for 700 days, but it turned out to be 1,000 days. But nonetheless, we gave them the keys to do all the work there. When it came back, we opened in September of 23. We didn't have a heavy rain that year until November, right before Thanksgiving. Torrential downpours, and that's when we found out the building leaks. Our maintenance staff went into the basement there and pulled out 60 gallons of water. And in the elevator shaft, there's 4 inches of water. As you go downstairs, that building was 1962, that's when it was built. And it was supposed to open for the 100th anniversary of the battle in September of 1962, but in the summer of that year, the Park Service received extra funding to install the bomb shelter. I did a Cold War, needed a fallout shelter for Sharpsburg. As you go down the stairs to your right, that is, you pass through that little hall, there's an arch, it's 3 feet thick. Why is the wall so thick? Well, that's 3-foot concrete behind it. You go into the bomb shelter. And that's where the building is leaking, from one of the corners back there. So our guys then were able to figure out where the water is leaking in from. So if you go up there today, you're gonna see out back, plastic sheeting on the ground. Looks terrible, but what it's doing is protecting. Our guys were able to figure out where the leak's coming in from. And right now, the plastic is covering that. We haven't had any leaking issues. Now we're just having the problems getting the contract through the offices downtown. That's all I can say about it. All right. Anything else? Thank you.
Again,
Thank you.
all right, again, everybody, Brian kind of gave us a sneak peek, but we will be having Gary Edelman for our last talk of the season, coming out next month.